Record this.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Some have greatness thrust upon them. Apparently Councillor Goss is stuck at the bottom of the Dutch Quarter somewhere. There's been an accident, so I'll take over the chair until he arrives. So welcome, everybody. Before we start, a few matters of housekeeping. Just to remind people, audio recordings are made of all our meetings, and these recordings are published on the Council's website. Secondly, please would everyone use the microphones at all time, and please make sure you speak directly into the microphone. Thirdly, members of the committee may use electronic devices to access meeting papers, and the use of mobile phones and other devices, including cameras, by visitors is welcomed, but you are requested to use them discreetly. Set them to silent and to not use voice or camera flash functions. Those using such devices are asked to remain seated during the meeting. We have no planned fire alarm tests, so if the alarm sounds, please leave the building by the nearest available exit. Go to the assembly area in the car park at the rear of the town hall. There are toilets on every floor in the building, and an induction loop is in this room. So I just do introductions of the committee that have managed to get themselves here. I'm Lynn Barton, I'm Vice Chair, and I'm a Shrub End Councillor, and I'll start on my right.
I'm Councillor Barry Cook for St Anne's Ward.
Councillor Christopher Arnold, Fordham and Stour Ward.
Councillor Elizabeth Blundell, Marks Tay Ward.
Councillor John Jowers, West Mersey Ward.
Councillor Andrew Ellis, Bircham Winstry Ward.
Councillor Kim Nash, Beerchurch Ward.
Councillor Gerard Oxford, Highwoods Ward.
Sandra Scott, Planning Officer for Colchester Borough Council.
Good evening, Jess Tipper. I'm the Archaeological Advisor to the Borough Council.
Paul Wilkinson, Transportation Policy Manager at Colchester Borough Council.
Karen Sywett, Place Strategy Manager.
Amanda Chidgey, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you very much. I don't believe we have any substitute members this evening, so we'll press straight on. Item 3, urgent items, I have none. And so we move to item 4, any declarations of interest? No, not from anybody? No. Okay, so we move on quickly to item 5, have your say. And we do have one speaker this evening, Tony Ellis, on behalf of Langham Parish Council. So if you'd like to come forward. I don't know if you know the procedure, but you have up to 3 minutes to make representations.
And a 2-minute bell, yes?
And a 2-minute bell, yes, it's not written on here. But yes, after 2 minutes, a bell. Thank you very much. When you're ready, press the button.
Good evening, my name is Tony Ellis, Chair of Planning at Langham Parish Council. I also have fellow members with me in attendance. The Issues and Options publication, plus key information conveyed at the roadshows carried out by Colchester Borough Council, (CBC), clearly identified 3 potential growth options for the new local plan. Each of these options had an A and B element, with B allowing for proportional growth in the borough's villages. These options went out for consultation by CBC, and an open meeting to explain the growth options was also held by Langham Parish Council, attended by over 100 people. It is easy to understand that the Call for Sites phase of the local plan needed to be introduced to provide access to additional land in the borough to enable them to deliver whichever of the 3 options is chosen. Our major concern is that the call for sites has become a call for other options, and I make reference to garden settlement schemes which do not fit comfortably with the original options. As you would expect, option 3 is of significant interest to Langham, as it has the most impact on the village. As a reminder to the committee, option 3 was development of a sustainable settlement to the east of the town, crossing the border with Tendring, urban extension to the town, north of the A12, development of sites in and around the existing urban areas and proportional growth in rural district centres. As with all the options, the B element would also allow for proportional growth in the villages. We are extremely concerned that the development scheme for 4,000 new homes in Langham is receiving serious press coverage, and it is causing a major worry to local residents in and around Langham, which also borders on the Dedham Vale AOMB. We are also of the opinion that this scheme does not fit in with the published options. We understand that all submissions are being considered, including past proposals, but this is placing some parish councils in a difficult position. Langham have confidence in the process and the work carried out by CBC Planning Policy Team in order to allow CBC to undertake the assessment of site submissions. And until now, we have resisted the temptation to form a local campaign group, as has happened with the East and West options. I would conclude by saying that we fully support any activity that provides an early assessment and conclusion to some of the contentious submissions and development schemes put forward that in our view do not fit with the published growth options. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Ellis. Is there anyone of the councillors that would like to respond to that, make any general comments? Yeah, Councillor Blundell.
Thank you, John. Can we ask Mrs Sarrett if Langham have been approached and had the opportunity to have a discussion about their preferences for what might happen in the future, including garden settlements as a possibility, please?
When you say Langham, do you mean the parish council?
Yes, yes, sorry, yes.
Yes, we've had a number of meetings already with Langham Parish Council, and I think we've got a number of meetings scheduled going forward as well. So we are engaging with them, as we're trying to with other parish councils as well, some more successfully than others. But yeah, Langham have always been very much engaged, so please be assured that that's ongoing.
Yeah, Councillor.
I'm not sure whether this is important or not, but I've been liaising with Langham, people in Langham about local plan, not on a political basis because we had different politics, but because they didn't have a councillor to do it for them, I'd stood in for a little while and passed on information. I think I ought to just declare that. That's it. I just wanted to declare it.
Councillor Jowers.
It's really a question to Mrs Syrett in that, I mean, in terms of the options, the issues of major settlements were pretty clearly defined as to be as accurate as I can, and we can't be accurate. Probably Clingo Hill and Marks Tay. In other words, it was clearly east and west, not northeast or northwest. Would that be a correct interpretation, Gary?
Yeah, sorry, I just had to refresh my memory as I didn't have the book in front of me.
Crystal clear in my memory. Answer from Mrs Syrett. I was a bit of...
Yes, you shouldn't have been speaking to someone else, Chris.
I haven't... This is the first words I've uttered, John. Your imagination is running riot.
I'm going to move my seat in a minute.
Thank you. What I wanted to say in response to the confession to my friend Barry on my left here is that as sort of one of the councillors for the adjacent patch of sort of Boxted, and as somebody who sat through 2 reviews of the local plan with the late Councillor Garnett, as he then was, at my side, this is territory with which I am very familiar, and I've certainly been watching very closely since the first we realised that the square at Langham was once again being offered up for development. And I will continue to do that because I'm very, very well aware of what the local feeling is. Again, like Councillor Cook, it's not my patch, but it is extremely close to my patch, and I'm very well aware of what the local feeling is. And I think we have to stick. In the middle of your presentation, which I find myself agreeing with a great deal of and expressing the concern. I believe you were asking if we could give some early reassurance. In that case, it's not something we can do, and you would, I think, be the 4th to be in front of this panel asking whether we can knock a site out early. What we're absolutely clear we have to do is stick to process, because if we don't stick to process, then we actually make the sites that we identify more vulnerable by trying to lift them out of the scheme early. But I think the square at Langham is something which will be looked at very closely, and as Councillor Jowers says, it wasn't there in the original thoughts about what we needed to do in order to get to the total that we need to build in order to satisfy demand over the next, is it 15 years, Karen? I can never remember. And since that total was arrived at, it's been falling, and at our last meeting we, I think, decided that it had gone from somewhere like 1,250 down to approximately 920, although that figure still needs some work. So while, yes, other sites and other considerations seem to have come into the frame, the target figure that we have to build in the borough has been coming down quite substantially. So I don't know if that offers any reassurance. I'm quite sure we can't go as far as starting a process that would lead to the square coming out early, but please be aware that just because you happen to be without a councillor at the moment, you are not without friends.
I think, bearing in mind some councillors didn't hear what I said and I was a bit unsure, I've just checked the plans, and options 1 and 2 showed extensions to the east and west. Where option 3 maybe added something was it showed an indicative arrow going north and suggested it could possibly be an urban extension as opposed to a new settlement. But an urban extension is obviously quite a different concept to a garden settlement.
Whilst we're on this, Martin, I have a very clear recollection that there was a strong will from this panel that there would be no extension north of the A12. Am I correct?
100% correct. Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for my tardiness, but public transport has let me down from the start of the day with suicides, and hasn't got much better through the day, unfortunately. But anyway, I'm here, so thank you for coming. Thanks for Lynn for standing in. We're now on item 7, I believe, which is to... Oh, sorry, item 6, sorry, on page 7, just to agree the minutes. Are there any queries or concerns about the minutes, or are you happy to approve them, note them, etc.?
Yep,
okay, consider those approved. We'll therefore then move on to item 7, which is Paul Wilkinson talking about the travel patterns.
Thank you, Chairman. I will run a presentation which will cover the data and some of the information in the presentation and the document. Hopefully we're not going to drill down into great detail. I think if there's detail about any specific ward or area, perhaps I could take those questions away separately and answer them outside. But just to say that obviously this he says is to note the findings of this report. Back in 2011, we all would have filled out a census, and part of that was travel to work information. We did some work last year on the first release of the data, producing this report. We did make some few minor changes, and that's why it's got September 2015 on the document. And we did put it as part of our issues and options local plan evidence base back in January this year. Just to remind ourselves, 4 years ago, 2011 census, and the questions that you would have been asked. You obviously would have been asked where you live as one of the early questions, but question 40 was about your main job and the address of that workplace. That just checking up was actually aimed at the place of your main place of work. So in the week of the census, which was in late March. But if you work at home or offshore installation, which a few people do, might be an oil rig or a gas rig in the North Sea, or no fixed place of work, you have to tick one of the boxes below. And I'll come back to no fixed place of work because that actually creates a little interesting, I find it interesting, dilemma on some of the presenting of the data. And if you report to a depot, like you might be a delivery man, delivery driver, just going to a depot to report, you would put your depot in as the base place. The other question that was linked to this is actually then how do you travel to work? How do you usually travel to work? And the key thing is to tick the longest part by distance for your usual journey to work, and you have 11 choices in there, right, going from working at home as a choice through to other, but also then you have taxis in there, you've got driving, you got train, and including light rail or tram and underground. And some people from Colchester do actually respond by actually saying they use underground, metro, light rail or tram, which it's just a quirk in the questions. The document itself, which is reproduced as the appendix to the report, we split it into, there's a summary at the front of key findings, and then there's a presentation by pie chart of borough data of journeys in and out of the borough. Then I split it rural workplace zones and urban workplace zones, and then also a small piece on journeys from tendering. Just to make you aware, workplace zones were set up for the 2011 census, this set of data. They're slightly different from electoral wards. Some of these are one-to-one match to an electoral ward. Most of the urban areas are, like Castle is Castle. But the ward I've given as a presentation in here, as a rural ward, is joined together, and I think it's Fordham and West Burgolt has actually been joined together. So actually, from this data, this set of data we used, it's very difficult to give you specific information about individual wards, but looking at the census data, that they may have done a later release giving electoral wards. And the workplace zones were set up so that there was a balance of workers in each of the wards. Whether it's right or not, that's the way the data came through from census data. Just to cover this page and the table in the middle, which is journeys into the borough, just things like Chelmsford City, by the way, means the whole of the borough of Chelmsford. And Greater London, if I refer to Greater London, is the whole of London. It's not just central London, the city. It is including Havering, Romford, Enfield, and even possibly places like Heathrow or North and parts of North London. So Greater London is all of that inside the M25, basically. So just do a rural workplace zone. So this is what I've selected out of the document. Part of Fordham and Stour and West Burgolt 8 Ash Green Ward, which was workplace zone 3. So there's a reference there. And this is a typical rural ward it's typical certainly for mode share per car, around the 63% of people travelling to work, which is the big blue section, the light blue section in the top pie chart. And you can see in the pie chart that it's typical for car travel. Also, the interesting one here is actually the second biggest element is the work or mainly at home for 15%, and that's a feature of a lot of the rural wards now. Is you're beginning to see a growth in working at home for main purpose. Coming down to the table in the middle, for this ward there are something like 3,300 workplace trips out of that ward, out of that workplace zone on a daily basis. The top one is percentage terms in volume is 342 people going to Castle, 235 going to Greater London, and then at third place is Fordham and Stour in itself with 203 people. So there's, and that's quite a continual feature in here, is that there are a lot of local trips being made and people actually going to work within their own workplace zone, which isn't always picked up. It's very easy to see the big volumes of traffic on the A12, it's easy to see the big volumes of people going to commuting to and from the railway station, but there's lots of little movements within each of the workplace zones. And the other one, I suppose, is just to pick up on this one as an example. On the other locations, this total sum is 1,421, so it's 43% of all the trips, but they're all less in terms of, all less than, in this case, 5%. And you can see that Braintree district with 149 is 5%. So other locations, which could be other wards in Colchester, could be off to Chelmsford, or could be off to Malden, is less than 5%. So you can see there's a lot of destinations that haven't actually identified here. Also, you can see the no fixed workplace as well, which in there, it's, which might be your plumber or your electrician, or maybe even a type of freelance type of person now who doesn't report to an office, just picks up a job and goes off and does that job, maybe a more self-employed type person. Just at the bottom, and everyone has got this, it's a bit it's sharper on in the documents, is a map showing basically the top 5 movements and arrows indicative of what the directions are. The directions don't indicate the route though, because obviously certain places might have more than one route, and obviously they don't indicate the mode as well. So typical urban, similar presentation. Again, this is a part of a ward. So this is Shrub End Ward, Workplace Zone 15. There's a pie chart, and this is typical again for an urban ward. Is the 54% of people travel to work by car. Pat on the back for Shrub End Ward, for 10% of people cycle to work from Shrub End Ward, which is higher than the borough average. But you can see again, over half is by car, and then all the other modes, the the other 10, make up small proportions. Interesting in this one, I think it's the on foot is 13% as well. Again, there's a table below showing the top 5. You can see Shrub End features itself in it's the top place. Castle's in there as well. So just to give an overall picture then, so from the census in 2011, so this is people going to work, whether they're working within the borough, coming to work from outside, from maybe tendering or leaving the borough. There's just under 110,000 trips a day for these main trips to work. The census says that there's 86,075 employed residents live in the borough, and that includes 7,167 employed residents who said they had no fixed place of work, e.g. the plumber, electrician, freelance type person, which is also, so we don't know where they're going. And that's probably one of the problems now in the reporting of the census. That 7,000, a lot of them may stay in the borough, some of them may be going off to do jobs quite some far away. I'm sure we all know tradesmen who are going some way to do work and things like that nowadays. So if you exclude that 7,167, there are 54,058 employed residents who stay in the borough, and that gives us 69% of what we call self-containment, which is, I think as a number has stayed fairly stable for the last census. I think it's come down a little, and that might be partly due to changing commuter patterns, but 69%, 70% is high. But we do know that 24,850 employed residents left the borough to find work, and just under 23,000 employees come into the borough for work. So quite in balance. So within the borough, out of the 14 out of the 20 workplace zones, the originating zone is also a main destination. So it includes those who work at home as well, which, and that's, so there's a lot of short trips, as I've talked about, briefly mentioned. Castle Ward in the town centre, which has over 14,000 main jobs, is the most important destination for employment and features in the top 3 for 18 out of the 20 workplace zones. 10% of employed residents now work at home. It's 15% in the rural areas, slightly less than that in the urban areas. There's a large number of trips that go into these other locations, which actually are small numbers of trips, and it's obviously then difficult to track actually where they're going and such like. 55% of journeys in the borough are driving a car or van, and 45% then are of the other modes. So the other 9, not including the work at home, are travelling by bike, walking, cycling, or a passenger in a car, or maybe using train as well. Just to pick up on tendering, and so this is about journeys into the borough, and there's something like was it just over 23,000 trips into the borough for work. The biggest single quantum in terms of origin is from tendering, and 38% of those people of the 23,000 are coming from tendering on a daily basis. That works out as 8,737 trips. Just to put it in perspective, Braintree's the next highest at 3,665. From the tendering direction, 87% come by car or van, including the passenger. I think it's 82 if it's for the driver. And the key destinations, again, Castle, of that 8,737, Castle Ward is the most important, then Mile End, then Highwoods, and then Mile End. Highwoods, obviously, probably with the North Colchester Business Park, located close to the A12 Crown Interchange. And Mile End, I think, probably because of the hospital, probably provides a lot of employment for people in tendering. Just to give a summary and a couple of other bits, but census data is robust with a high level of response rate, but it does have limitations. The borough itself achieved a 94% return rate on its census across the whole borough, and I assume that obviously people answered their questions. We assume people answered their questions fairly and accurately, and that question 40 and 41. It is readily accessible data, which I'll just show you a bit afterwards on this, but it does only cover the main work trip and the main mode. Obviously, in today's society, there are people who may have more than one job, but they have to decide what their main work is, and they also have to decide what their main mode is. And this is where things like cycling to the railway station doesn't get picked up because people are doing a longer trip by train. And it normally undercounts in terms of walking as well, because all modes generally involve a little bit of walking as well. When you start to, if you could overlay these drawings and all the rest of it, and you start to see the movements, there's a complex pattern of movements that begins to emerge, especially with the other destinations being a lot of small trips, and also then the local short trips are important in each of the workplace zones, and they shouldn't be underestimated, but I think people forget about them, that they're actually happening and taking place. Castle, as I say, Ward is the key destination because that's where there's the biggest amount of employment. And flow from tendering puts pressure on the eastern side of Colchester, but it is the biggest quantum from one direction. And the car dominates the mode share. It's at 54% in the urban areas and 63% in the rural areas. And anybody coming in, including the tendering, so people come from Braintree or Baber or Suffolk Coastal or Morden, the modal share for car is 81%. Obviously, things have moved on a lot in technology, and the document produced here, we had access to a work experience student who worked through the data and produced this for us. This data is now readily available on in other formats. There's a place called DataShine, and this was done by UCL College. Which not necessarily saying it's better, but I can produce, and we've got in front of you here, you've got all the wards, whereas if you go onto this, you can't get every ward at the same time. So as much as they have their place. Also on the census, there's an interactive map of where do I commute to as well, and you can just see on here, there's a blue line, and each line represents a journey and a trip out of the borough into different locations, and you can see there's sort of westward movements, and yes, there is supposedly somebody said they were going over to Northern Ireland on the census day, so you do get some of those vagaries, and that may have been their main purpose. But that's the report. As I say, it is for information. Happy to take some questions. I think if they're more detailed about some numbers in specific wards, perhaps I can get back afterwards rather than necessarily unless I know the answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So to kick off questioning, we have Councillor Naish.
Thank you, Chair. It only picks up the longest part of your journey. What about the journeys, if you like, to and from the station where someone's travelling to London? Will that not sort of skew the figures of cars and what have you coming into the borough? Thank you.
Census data is one source of information, and yes, it does. That trip, if you're catching a taxi to the station or for your regular place of work, which happens to be in London, you should answer that the train is your main mode and the taxi wouldn't be picked up. So yes, there is an issue that it only picks up the travel to work and it's the main mode as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Next on my list, we have Councillor Blundell.
What I'd like to say is thank everybody for all the hard work that's gone into this, and I don't want to sound cynical if I think that the information we've learnt this evening is probably not a great surprise to us. You're going to expect people to go to their nearest workplace a lot of the time, I think, not always. And I'd like to know exactly how you're going to turn this into positive information. Are you going to try and get us to use different methods of transport? And finally, next year on May the 5th, we're going to be changing all the ward boundaries. So this will sort of have to change a bit. Is it going to be easy from a technology point of view to change what you've already done? Thank you.
Can I answer the second one first? I have no answer to that. And I think that may be a question we need to take back to our census and research team, because that affects the whole of the borough and presentation of data and how that will be done. So I don't know. On the first question about whether you use this data, yes, there is information obviously in here that shows there are short trips that could be done. And if you combine that with some other data around travel, national travel survey data, which actually begins to look at data across the whole day and all trips, you could begin to see there's a lot of probably short car trips in this mix that could be done by other modes. And there are probably some places where you have to say that is probably the most appropriate mode. Yeah, the 81% actually is high, but how do you tackle that 81% when people are coming into other borough from outside? What's the options? Is it bus? Is it train? Yeah, we know from tendering, why don't more people use the Clacton to Colchester rail line?
And then we have...
I'm sorry, did you say you didn't know that one? Was that the one you didn't know?
That's the one I don't know, but we need to take it back to our research team.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mr Chairman.
Keep up, Liz. Next questioner is Councillor Arnold.
Thank you, Chairman. As sometimes happens, I'm going to talk about your ward as well as mine. And I'm just going to hark back 2 or 3 meetings when I raised or just wanted to put up a flag about a concern of mine, which was the extent to which the 76, as they were originally, acres of employment land in North Colchester has been whittled away to provide funding for this and funding for that and kickstart for that and so on. And pump priming is the other favourite expression, isn't it? And I think I found some favour, but not universal favour for my view, that we really ought to do an exercise and just see how much of what remains of that employment land compares with the demand that's likely to be from the local area, the 4,000 houses that are due to go up in yours and Lord knows how many might come as a result in mine. Because if we've actually got that many people making just short trips, and in Great Hawksley I've known for years, of course, we've got lots of people who work at the hospital who live in Great Hawksley, but they're just making short trips either within their own ward or into the adjacent ward, then actually that employment, the argument that that employment land is needed for the people who are going to live in those 4,000 houses or whatever goes on north of the A12 is a much stronger argument. Because we've got data that suggests that it's already happening. So I think it was very helpful to have this. It's actually very helpful information right the way through, and I was very interested to see it. But I think I just wanted to lodge that in the minds of fellow members of the committees and officers. This data would appear to support the fear I expressed on that occasion. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that. Just to be factually correct on housing numbers, it's actually 2,700 that's due between Chesterwell and the Severals development, because there's been a change that is in the public domain where Severals has reduced to 1,000 houses, I believe, from 1,500. So it is 2,700, and I'm including the 100 homes that Persimmon have just put in for on Axial Way, just to be completely factually correct.
Thank you, Chairman. In that case, could I ask you whether the 850 that were supposed to go into the grounds are still there of Severals Hospital?
Severals between phases 1 and 2 is 1,000.
Right.
So the next questioner was Councillor Jowers, I believe.
Thanks, Chairman. As everyone else says, very interesting piece of work. It does bring to mind the old case of lies, damn lies and statistics sometimes. Because when you look at the other locations figures in this, it's a pretty anodyne term, other locations. What are these other locations, particularly when you look at Tiptree, where not a single person from Tiptree works in Colchester? Which that may just be a statistical error, or maybe, just something going wrong somewhere. I don't want to admit that they work in Colchester. Well, I hadn't thought of that one. But when it approaches 50%, other locations, then I have sort of just a little suspicion that we're maybe not quite as accurate as we could be. Would that be a viable, valid comment, Paul?
I think using Tiptree as the example there, Colchester would be within the other locations for Tiptree. And so the trouble is, actually looking at this diagram here, is that the other locations could be anywhere in the UK. So you would end up with a very long list of what those other locations are. So we've just presented, if you like, the data for the top 5 locations, and you'll have to accept the other locations, because it could be somebody going off to West London. It could be going to, it would be somebody going to that ward somewhere in Northern Ireland. And it would end up with a very extreme long list. And so that's why we presented it as top 5. We could, I have got the raw data to know where those people at Tiptree are going.
Yes, but, if we are going to follow on from Councillor Arnold's point, in that we should be looking at employment zones as to where we find our travel patterns, and we wish to make a modal shift one way or another, then I would have suggested that perhaps we need some little degree more accuracy. In other words, you could have lumped together all of the urban wards, as you have done, actually. You've split this into 2, from rural to urban. I look at Mersey, and actually I see Colchester from Mersey is nominated. Yeah. So all I'm saying is that for it to be credible to the man on the, not the Clapham omnibus, I think there needs to be a degree of consistency in these figures. I totally accept, the other locations, but when, as I say, when it's 50%, you're starting to get into the realms of La La Land, aren't you, really?
Next, Councillor Barton.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to see the increase in the number of people cycling to work, particularly in my ward. I wondered, Paul, if there's any correlation, because with Shrub End there's been a significant investment in cycle routes all through Abbey Fields and Bodicea Way, and whether that relates and shows, the impact of how good it is to actually invest in cycle routes.
Where we've made investments, and I think that if you see it, things like around the railway station, where there's been a high level of secure parking put in, improvements to routes, and linked with the work that the lady who's from Sustrans, and we have based in Colchester as well, the CTC officer as well, where they're promoting cycling. Yeah, we've seen increases in cycling. Travel to work data, this census data doesn't actually pick up that, but I do know that cycling is growing. From other data, cycling is growing in those locations, and those programmes do have an effect.
Thank you.
Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. I think Councillor Jazz mentioning the man using the omnibus wasn't referring to anyone in rural wards, because one of the things that is highlighted in here is how few people use public transport from rural wards, which I think probably highlights what a poor service we have in rural wards with public transport. Most of my villages are quite appallingly serviced. If you live in Salcott, you can go to Mersey, I think, in the morning, and I think you have to leave Mersey in the afternoon at some point, but you have to stay there all day. Not everybody wants to spend the entire day on Mersey, especially if they're just going shopping. But there you go. Interesting, really, just to know exactly how you're using this data, Paul. I mean, it's fascinating, don't get me wrong, but your conclusions, I'm not being critical, but they just say what's gone on, but you're not saying what you're going to do with it. Are you going to be using it, I think as Councillor Blundell was alluding to try and change people's behaviour? Are you going to use it, as Councillor Arnold was talking about, to actually look at where you need employment zones or what have you, for, you know, closest to the places that people are actually trying to access Colchester? What do you actually do? I mean, it's fascinating, a huge amount of work, but I just wonder what you're actually going to do with it at the end of the day.
The data, we use it as part of local plan evidence, so it features in there, and it also helps paint that picture of what the movements are and such like. We work with our colleagues at Essex County Council who do modelling work. They have access as well to travel to work data as well, and they use that data to help them build travel patterns. We also work with working with people like the train operating companies, for instance, and we tell them that, you know, Mile End is the most important ward. 18% of people travel to work by train from Mile End, and that's so you can begin to create strategies, stories, defend schemes, and why you maybe want to promote cycling more in an urban area than, say, a rural area. Also, I suppose, picking up on public transport is issues about, is the fact that low levels of people using public transport, is it because of the service, or people are, they're not on those routes? So we do use the data. We haven't put it into here in the conclusion and such like. This is just really presenting the data as it's come from census, but in a user format that where we as officers have got a booklet that we can take to meetings and pull out, and it is raw data, and it is some base level data to start painting the picture and articulate the case for schemes.
We've got Councillor Cook next, and then Councillor Jowers after that.
Paul, you just answered basically the burning question I was having about what you're going to do with it all now you've got it. But I want to ask Karen, how's it going to affect the local plan, and what does it do to facilitate where we build houses and businesses? Can you just give us an indication?
I think I just jotted down a couple of things as councillors were talking. I think, you know, this sort of information relates to all sorts of other information, like Councillor Arnold referred to the employment zones in North Colchester. And I think it's good to recognise the importance of having employment land located close to new homes or existing homes as well. Tiptree was mentioned, and I know we've done some work in Tiptree on just how many people worked at the Wilkins factory when we were producing the local plan for Tiptree. And it was quite a high percentage of people lived and worked there, but obviously, if you just look at numbers, wasn't enough to actually feature Tiptree in those top 5 areas. Helps inform a local plan for things like Councillor Barton mentioned, Shrub End. Why is that higher than other areas? So we can look and we can see, well, Shrub End comes up higher than Mile End, although when they get that new cycleway, maybe things will change. Mersey, Councillor Jowers will know, doesn't have any cycleway along Coast Road, and when there's a demonstration, dreadfully hard to cycle along there, isn't it? I saw. So it enables us, I imagine Shrub End partly picks up some of the garrison development, and as you mentioned, really good cycle paths, and you need to plan that in from the start of any new development. So it's that sort of thing. You're looking at major new growth locations. Actually, does this tell us anything about the need for a park and ride in the future in any particular location? Does it suggest that we should be doing more with the train operators? I think there's quite a lot that we can take from this and use in the local plan. What we didn't think was this was the document to actually give those answers, because it's more than just this is the baseline data on travel to work. There's far more plays into it, and that's how the local plan is produced. I mean, already we've heard quite a few things in the discussion tonight that demonstrate how one sort of links into another. So
basically we're saying this stimulates planning into where we put houses, what cycle routes we can put in, where we put businesses. That's the stimulation. Am I right?
It's certainly one of the considerations, yes. Yeah.
Councillor Jowers, please.
I think Karen's partially answered the question I was going to ask, and the mention is link. And, you know, I was interested in linkages of data. In the past, we've had travel patterns. You know, obviously, if you live in Shrubend, you can cycle into Colchester. If you live in Mersey, it's actually slightly more difficult. In other words, you know, you have to do an outgoing zone map of where it's likely to happen. Of course, you're going to get Shrubend, you know, places like that are going to cycle in, because, you know, why wouldn't you?
It's close.
But equally, some of this data could be refined and put, say, to Rodney at County Council, in that why do people not use the bus? Now, you know, I think this might have come up before, mightn't it? Is if you are going to put antiquated shower bangs with sort of cart springs on them in the rural areas, belching out diesel smoke, because there is no coherent view of saying, you know, actually we're going to put some decent public transport on, then, you know, all right, we've got the data, but we're not looking any further than that, is to say, why don't you? Well, I know why you don't use it. I wouldn't go on a local bus. I mean, it's there for training modern-day Fangios, as far as I can find. They're dreadful. But that doesn't come out of this. So it's the link.
Councillor Naish.
Yes, Chair. Perhaps we could get Essex County Council to subsidise the buses.
They do.
Even more to get people out of their cars in the rural areas. I mean, if you're only having one bus a day at certain times, surely there should be encouragement to get people out of their cars onto the buses and provide a decent bus service.
I want to start drawing this to a close.
If I could just answer Kim, if he goes down to the members' room, he will find a comprehensive questionnaire to Essex County Council stating what improvements do you wish and what do you want to see on the bus routes.
Councillor Blundell, is this going to be a...
So I'd just like to say in Cotford, we do literally get one bus a week in the road I live. Could there be some improvement to that, please?
Wrong. That's wrong committee, I think, for that. But anyway, and I'll try and sum this up just to complete this and move it on. My comments would be that, of course, since the 2011 census, we've built probably 3,400 homes, roughly, in the last 4 years, which is probably equating to roughly about an extra 6,800 residents if you take 2 per property. That's possibly on the low side. So my first question would be, I'm guessing we have no idea or no data for how those new houses or residents will be performing from a travel perspective, although you could probably use some clever maths to link it back to how the 2011 census was answered. And then the second point I'd like to make is it looks like there's a huge customer base, especially coming from tendering, that the park and ride could hopefully encourage, particularly as lots of those customers are travelling into the town centre. We're assuming that, as Carl Jenny's, or 87% or whatever the figure was, that they are parking in the town centre. Or 82, thank you. Memory isn't what it was. So I just wondered, again, have there been discussions with the County Council about this data in that respect? Maybe a stop at the hospital might encourage more people.
coming on to the growth that's happened since 2011, obviously the survey was 2011. We don't do any specific local surveys about in filling that gap. There was a comprehensive travel diary undertaken back in 2007, which actually looked at a whole load of movement patterns throughout the day as well. And you didn't get the issue of, is those people, those new houses, are they taken up by people just moving in, or are they people moving from another ward and things like that? So it's not quite as simple as saying the population has grown, so movement patterns and people moved out. We do a certain amount of work with some of the big organisations around travel planning as well, where we have some data that I've just seen the results of the Colchester Borough Council staff, which sits at around 49% of people travel by car, the hospital 63%, the university is 49% as well. So we do have some local data that is collected on an annual basis, but we don't do, nothing does quite comprehensively across the whole borough as a census, but it does have gaps.
Liz, you're sort of waving at me. Is this a very quick one?
Can I ask Paul, what is the next report we're going to get about transportation likely to include then? Are we going to see some results from information that you've provided tonight?
We're working with a piece of work we have in developing the local plan as well, so that will emerge partly through the local plan processes, but more comprehensive modelling around location of growth of development for the future. And we're working with the county, and that will produce reports as well, and draft reports from that. And we're likely to produce a topic paper that would be around transport. I mean, obviously, transport is one of the main issues that people raise about infrastructure provision to deliver new growth.
Thank you for that. 63% of people driving to the hospital. That's a very interesting statistics. Right, we are... Oh, staff, sorry. Right. Even worse. Even worse. OK, we're asked to note the report. Is it noted? Yes. Thank you. Right, let's move on to report 8. There are no public speakers. So over to Jess to talk about archaeology and development strategy.
Thank you very much, Councillor Goss. Thank you very much. I don't need to remind you of the importance and the value of archaeology and heritage to Colchester Borough. It's internationally important, nationally important, and valued by the local community, and that's recognised in our strategic plan. Archaeology as well, historic environment more generally, is recognised in legislation in the NPPF and also recognised in the local plan. I have prepared a technical guidance which is presented to you. I hope to present it to you, but I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can ask me questions on it, and I don't have any pretty PowerPoint presentation to show you either. What I do hope, death by PowerPoint. What I do hope it brings is detail and clarity of the approach that the council will take towards its archaeology and its heritage. I hope it provides clear guidance for developers and for archaeological contractors alike. And I think that's particularly crucial given the importance of archaeology here. I've consulted widely and researched widely. I've looked at other adopted strategies in similar environments, for example, Chester, which has a similar archaeological strategy for the town, the Roman town. And I think that's really important to look at what has been prepared elsewhere. I think it's important that we have consistency, obviously consistency in line with legislation and in line with the local plan, but also across the country in terms of archaeology and in terms of archaeological approaches, and in terms of the region as well, what our neighbours are doing. I've consulted with Historic England. They have seen a draft of the technical guidance and commented on it, and I have taken on board their comments. It was generally widely received by, well received, sorry, by Debbie Priddy, the Inspector for Ancient Monuments at Historic England. I've consulted with our museum service, colleagues in the museum service, obviously important. Philip Wise has very gratefully commented on it, and indeed the Colchester Archaeological Trust, Philip Crummy and Howard Brooks have both seen a copy of the document and commented on it and said how useful it is to have this guidance in place so that developers and archaeologists alike are clear on the approach that will be taken. In terms of the document, if I briefly go through it, there's a very short section at the start which sort of talks about the history of archaeology in the town, and indeed not just the town, but it's a borough document, and I think the previous document in 2014 was perhaps too much focused on the town, and we have to remember that obviously it's important, but we have to look at the entire borough. So there's a just get to the right page. Yeah, so there's a short section on page 3 of the document, page 53 of your document, of the town and then of the borough. It moves on to really then looking at sources of information. It talks about, it sort of explains what scheduled monuments are to everybody, so that the people are clear, listed buildings, conservation areas, before moving on to talk about the national legislation and the local plan. Obviously the document's consistent with that and states it and reinforces the policies, underpins the policies, if you like. In terms of the sources of information for scheduled monuments for designated assets, listed buildings, that's the National Heritage List for England, followed by the Urban Archaeological Database for the town, which was compiled over a period of years and funded by English Heritage, and that's a very detailed database of all the known archaeological investigations that have taken place within the town. So that's really a starting point for investigators doing the sort of the desk-based assessment to understand what we already know. Obviously, a lot of that work, I'm well aware, has been undertaken by the Colchester Archaeological Trust. So in many ways, we are at an advantage in this borough by having such a sort of an experienced team of local archaeologists. The document will obviously be digital, and there are hyperlinks throughout the document to sort of aid people in jumping around and finding information, as so much is digital and on the web these days. It talks about aerial photographs, historic landscape characterisation. These are all available online and ready for people to consult. As I say, it's not such a problem for those people that are familiar with Colchester's archaeology, such as the Colchester Archaeology Trust, when they're doing the investigations. It's more of an issue when we have other archaeological contractors being commissioned to do investigations who perhaps aren't so familiar with the town. So these are the sort of the starting points, really, if you like, and underpinned in the documentary evidence by the Essex Record Office. It moves on to look at how the council will make its decisions and look at really how I make my recommendations to the council in terms of defining sites of archaeological potential. Because of course the known archaeological remains are only likely to be a very small proportion of the actual sort of total data set that's out there. Obviously, we know a lot about the centre of the town, but once you get outside the town, there's been very little systematic investigation undertaken, and we're making new discoveries all the time. So it's sort of this section of the guidance gives a sort of a statement of what we will be looking for when new proposals, new applications come in, and then what we will be requiring developers or their archaeological consultants to provide, whether that's a short heritage statement or whether it's more detailed archaeological evaluation, such as geophysical survey, ground penetrating radar, moving on to conventional archaeological evaluation, trial trenching, test pitting to sort of ground truth. the archaeological potential. There's a sort of a staged a table on page 16, which I hope brings clarity to what is quite a complex process. And what I would intend to do is to flesh out this document with some photographs and some plans. Obviously, heritage is one of those things that we can present and make alive, rather than just a sort of a monotonous text, if you like. And then it moves on to assuming there's archaeological remains discovered, how we will protect and conserve those remains. Obviously, in the centre of town, where we know we've got deep stratified archaeological deposits, we'll be trying to preserve as much of the archaeological remains in situ, minimising the disturbance. That's most commonly done through piling to protect the archaeological remains. Elsewhere, it may not be possible, and we'll have preserved the archaeology through excavation. I think what this document has tried to do is to show how we front load the process in advising the need for as much investigation up front, predetermination investigation, obviously to define whether there's important archaeological remains there, which may be showstoppers and which we may need to preserve in situ because they're of such importance. But even where there aren't any showstoppers, I think it's important to front load the process in terms of good risk assessment, really, for developers, whereby archaeological remains that are encountered can be very expensive to develop for developers and can therefore be very problematic to development even when planning consent has been granted, if the archaeological remains are so expensive to excavate. Short sections on building recording, countryside advice, hedgerow recording, places of worship. Moving on, I think, crucially to public benefit and securing public benefit through the planning system, and by which I mean whether that might be open days on site, whether that might be presentations after excavations have taken place, whether that might be securing display of finds, whether it's in the museum or at an appropriate venue, whether that might be on site or close by. But I think, again, ensuring that that the sort of the benefit is not just to the academic community, where there's a dusty report that sits in a sort of a locked file and archaeological finds in a warehouse somewhere, that we try and promote as much as possible those archaeological discoveries and make them exciting to the public, so they're aware of quite what they've got. And finally, finishing up, there's a section on the curation of archaeological archives, because obviously preservation by record, digging up those remains, we generate a large archaeological archive, a record of finds, some of which may be of sufficient quality and merit to go on display, but most generally you find that there are hundreds of boxes of going into storage. And again, that's ensuring really that the developer pays for that storage. Currently, we are picking up the bill as a council to take on that material as a requirement through the planning system, and really is saying that no, that the developers should be picking up this bill to protect the remains in perpetuity. Finishing up, there's a glossary for generally sort of well-used terms these days. Obviously, we use quite interchangeably these days archaeology, historic environment record, designated assets, and I hope there's a sort of a short glossary that will explain to councillors, to my fellow officers, planners, and indeed developers and archaeological contractors. And then there's a section at the end which I think is important for where you can find more detailed information. Okay, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the first questioner we have this evening on this subject is Councillor Barton.
Just a quick one, really. Is the technical guidance already in use with other authorities? Because you talk about consistency across councils. So are they ahead of us with having already got it passed and implementing?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, a lot of authorities have archaeological strategies, historic environment strategies already in place. Yeah.
Can you just tell me then, as a historic town, why we're a bit behind?
Jess has only been here a little while.
Yeah, I've only been here for 6 months, which is one of the first things that I've done. I've recognised the importance of having a
But I would have
strategy
thought
and
somebody
written that.
before you would have
Yeah.
grasped that, but very good that it's happening.
Next on the list is our own archaeological find, Councillor Jowers.
All right, youngster. I did. With age comes experience. However, and as is patently obvious, I would say, but there we are. I have to declare one interest in that I not only know Adrian Gascoigne, but he worked for me. So I had 10 years in charge of this. This is a brilliant report, and it's long overdue because you're the kind of hidden heroes. In answer to your question, Lynn, it's because there just haven't been the staff. You know, it's been something that you just forget about. And I really had to struggle to ensure that we retained some form of archaeological facility at Essex, because quite a lot of it was outsourced to UCL. And UCL are very good, but then they're taking on vast areas of Britain. You know, they're not necessarily going to have that specific view of Colchester. What I'm really pleased with is that I have seen other authorities where this has been a restrictive view, and I think that Colchester, in terms of how you interpret it to the planning, well, you are a planning officer, so you're good with how the planning officers are sold some of these things, is actually very good. Couple of caveats. One of them is barns. Think, what the hell, barns? Well, we had one little guy in Essex years and years ago who was the world's expert on barns, and he went round and he listed just a few. And of course, once they're listed, you can convert them. You can make them residences. If they weren't listed, you can't. And I've seen, just in my area, barns that have collapsed. And because, you know, they're put in, over the years I've seen planning applications come in, and because they weren't on that one list that was done in 1957, you can't do anything with them. So they go. They're left to go. There are ways in which we could have a better interpretation of what the public would wish to see, that you could preserve some items. But having said that, it's only a minor gripe. And we did do it once. I did manage to get Vincent to change his mind on one near Bures years ago. And it took some doing, I'll tell you. But overall, it's an acknowledgement of just how rich a borough we are and how little we've actually looked at it. I thought actually during the Garrison Development Plan, the long trenching and the schemes we did, they were extraordinary. They were really good. But what I want you to see this is kept up is that balance between 21st century demands overlaid on 21 centuries or more of history, and I think you do it very well. So, you know, I just think it's a really, really good. I've had my minor gripe, because I really think we ought to look at that and perhaps change it. But other than that, more power to your elbow, and I think that as a political administration, as a political sort of entity, we should give this more weight. It's just as important as the other aspects of the planning system, probably more so, actually, because what makes Colchester? History, you know. So well done. There's nothing to answer there, is there really? About the barn.
Thank you very much.
Karen?
Thank you. I was just going to say, if we do work with the County Council and Adrian's team, so if there's anything you can say to make sure that they reciprocate that relationship, that would be very useful. I think there's Jess will correct me if I'm wrong, but we rely on some of the maps that Essex hold and things like that. So be useful if we could have access to them.
I will absolutely take that back, because it was something I was really, really passionate about, is involving the records office as holder of the mapping records and our archaeological places group. In fact, we even funded the last international conference of the Essex Society of Archaeology, because some of the transactions that they write are absolutely the most brilliant things you've ever read. How many people read them? They are amazing. And they're known not just locally, but internationally. They are really, really good. I'll take that back, but our group, Adrian's group, is under the cosh as well. You know, it's always one of those forgotten areas that, oh, it's there, you know, and they never get any funding.
Mandy, can we just make sure that is highlighted in the minutes so we can ask Councillor Jarvis for an update at the next committee, if that's okay? Just as we go through the minutes, we can do it that way. Thank you for that. Next on my list is Councillor Blundell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm getting no, stop it. I'd just like to echo what John said when he opened his speech. This is absolutely fantastic piece of work. I think it can give everybody in Colchester enjoyment and total confidence in that all our heritage is being guarded, looked after well, and sought out, you know, in connection with some of the planning applications. I am a governor at Colchester Sixth Form College, and we had some of your colleagues over there, and we had great big holes of interesting material found underground. It's all sort of very exciting. I mean, it appears to be a bit dull and dry and dusty, but it's very exciting. I'm not sure how much of this is taught or put in front of Colchester school children. My children were older when I moved here, but I'm sure it's something that should be well publicised. And really, I think, Mr. Tipper, I'm going to suggest you make this a book of reference. I thought it was really, really good, and we should be proud of those who have worked on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next comments and questions from Councillor Naish, please.
Thank you, Chair. Are wells covered by this? And is there a list or something showing where ancient wells are?
There's a map. On the sea map.
Well, wells would certainly be covered by it. They're archaeological remains. No, I don't have a definitive map, but I could probably extract them from the urban database. Those that are known, of course. There's probably a lot more that aren't, but yes, certainly it'd be covered by it.
So when a well's found, if you like, then that's investigated, wouldn't it be?
It is. More often than not with wells, we would look at preserving them in situ, in place, because generally, if they're very deep, it should be possible to preserve them in place with below developments. So it would be nice to investigate them, but it's hard to justify where those deposits aren't going to be destroyed, I think. You certainly do. Often a lot of rubbish has been thrown in there, complete vessels, and often you get waterlogging by their very nature in the base of wells. So you get leather, preserved leather shoes and other artefacts. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for that. Next on the list is Councillor Arnold.
Thank you, Chairman. I associate myself with the praise that's been given to this, particularly by Councillor Blundell. I think I would have liked to have said a lot of that. There's one thing I would pull out, which is the third bullet on the first. The third bullet from the bottom on the first page of the document, which is 51 of the report, about identifying opportunities for residents and visitors to participate in heritage initiatives. I considered myself very lucky in that when I was 14, the summer when I was 14 and the summer when I was 15, I was actually able to participate in a dig in Colchester and uncover quite a large section of Roman Road, which ran underneath the grammar school site. And it has left me with a lifelong impression of how important these things are and a passion for Colchester's archaeology. But over the years, we have seen digs that have gone on here and there, and I remember Culver Square when that was going on years ago, which were completely fenced off, unless you were very lucky and somebody had left the door or gate open or somewhere. So I particularly like, out of all the things I like here, this identifying opportunities to residents to get hands-on with it, because it's one thing to read about it, and I agree with Councillor Blundell, you know, it actually would make a good book. But actually to get hands-on with it, if that can happen. I mean, I know there are certain bits of it that can only be done by those with expertise, not to do damage as they go and to recognise what they find. But actually getting down and dirty with Colchester's past is something for which there is no substitute, and it really teaches you how to have a feel for the place that you live in or you grow up in. One thing I was wondering, and I'm probably far too late, and I will run up the flag anyway, and if nobody salutes it, I shall not be disappointed too much. I think the title's ever so dull. Archaeology and Development Strategy. Quite apart from development strategy making you think it's about something else, I wondered whether you consider managing archaeology in development as a slightly catchier title, which actually tells you what the document does. You can put the sort of strategy word in underneath somewhere as a subtitle, but I would like to suggest that managing archaeology in development would be a better title for it.
Yes, very happy to take that suggestion. Yes.
I actually second that. I think that's not a bad idea. Councillor Ellis, please, and then Councillor Oxford, and then that is it.
Well, it must be a good idea because Councillor Jazz has said it is a good idea, and if it's come from, if it's a suggestion from Councillor Arnold and Councillor Jazz thinks it's a good one, then that must be good. I'd associate myself with everything that's been said in the praise that's been heaped on this. I think it's excellent, but I just wonder, can developers insure against archaeological discoveries and what have you? Because I just wonder what the cost implications are for development going forward. Given what you've said, is there any risk that people, because of the cost, because these are, I take it, storage of materials, etc., if we're saying it's expensive and we have to pick up the tab, is an expensive thing to undertake. Is it any reason that archaeological finds might not be declared? I'm just asking that. I'm sure they legally have to be, but I'm just asking the question. If we start heaping expense onto developers, are we going to find that maybe the fines go down rather than up? I just wonder if it's insurable against, if you know, and what sort of cost implication you think it does have on development.
In terms of insurance, I don't know. It's not something I've ever looked at. I really don't know. In terms of risk assessment, then it's obviously in developers' interest to do the investigations at a very early stage, very often for major developments prior to purchasing land even, or then you can use it as a negotiation tool if you know there's archaeological remains on there that are going to cost money to develop. But that said, in the scale of a large development, the archaeological cost is very, very small. You know, although it's large, I think it's disproportionately large with householders. You know, where you're putting on an extension, and if you happen to be in the Roman cemetery, then it's disproportionately large to the cost. And I think that's where we run into problems time and time again. In terms of requiring deposition or at least declaring fines, if it's a requirement of the planning system, then I wouldn't advise discharge of a planning condition through, obviously, if there's a planning condition attached to the consent, until the archaeological work has been successfully been completed in accordance with a written scheme. And we rarely have any problems. Occasionally you get schemes where there hasn't been any archaeological investigation, that the developer has gone ahead and dug their footings, but more often than not it's nothing malicious. It's purely because they haven't understood the need to do an investigation. Very often developers are interested in the archaeology as anyone else. Yeah.
Karen.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I think I'd reinforce what Jess has said about early investigation and sort of understanding. Certainly, last time around at site allocation stage, we ruled out sites that we were looking at because English Heritage at the time had suggested that there would be likely to be significant archaeological remains in that area, so we excluded that from the site allocations. So it didn't even get as far as someone buying the site or thinking about development. Obviously, we wouldn't know that in all instances, but...
Asking, are we going to be attaching that condition to rather more applications now, given that you've been saying we've got probably a greater wealth of archaeology underneath us in the wider borough? I can see how many places that some of the places I didn't know about where I mean Birch Pit and what have you. I didn't realise just quite how much archaeology was out there.
I think that's quite true. I don't think there'll be a change in approach, particularly within the town centre. But I think outside the town, in the villages and rural areas, then very much so. There'll be more investigation. Yeah.
Okay, and final commentator or questioner for this item is Councillor Oxford.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just querying one point. It says here, designated heritage assets. Amongst them, it says registered parks. My interest is, of course, Highwoods Country Park, whether that's a registered park. But in DP 14 on page 7 or 57 of 82, whichever you want, in little 3, it says historic parks. So there's a differential between the two. Which one? You know, which is which, in fact?
I suspect in policy DP 14 on page 7 of the document, it should actually refer to registered parks and gardens, but we're actually in the process of revising policy DP 14 at the moment, so it's something we can pick up in the revisions. Yeah.
So my question is Highwoods Country Park a registered garden or park?
I'll look into that for you and get back to you. Yep.
Again, if we can make sure that's clear in the meeting notes, Mandy, so that doesn't get lost. Okay, well, thank you for that. I've just got a couple of very quick comments. I think it's a really good piece of work. I think it does lead into what Colchester needs to improve on in promoting its heritage. I think this is a building block for that. So obviously our museum and tourism colleagues need to grasp this and push it to bring about the Colchester experience, as I call it, because we have got a lot to offer. I just don't think we push it enough. And then, of course, it's not directly related, but one of the other big concerns is all our listed buildings, where some of them do tend to burn down, etc. Obviously, this isn't directly related, but there is obviously concern about protecting that part of heritage as well, where buildings fall into disrepair, and then it's considered they're not economic to repair, and therefore legislation allows them to disappear. Maybe that's something I would like to look at in the future, but good piece of work. Is everybody happy to adopt this, subject to the comments, questions, and the title change? Brilliant. Well, thank you for that, and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Colchester and the council and everything else. Right. Moving swiftly on to item 9 before anything else is said. Let's get moving on the responses to the consultations, and we'll hand across to Sandra Scott, please.
Thank you, Councillor Goss. I too haven't got a presentation or PowerPoint. It's quite difficult to pretty up strategic land availability assessment and sustainability appraisal frameworks. So I'll just make a few points to draw out some of the points and about the consultation. Both the strategic land availability assessment and sustainability appraisal are technical and statutory processes, and they're both underpinned by fairly detailed guidance to the process and the way in which they need to be prepared. these are need to be interpreted locally to reflect specific local circumstances, but the guidance is pretty clear at a national level. So, in setting the framework, we consulted on the initial framework so that everybody was clear about the way in which the assessments would be made, both for the strategic land availability assessment and the sustainability appraisal, specifically in relation to the garden settlements, because the sustainability appraisal is an iterative process, and the scoping of the approach was out for consultation earlier in the year as part of the issues and options, and there was specifically in relation to the sustainability appraisal, the concept of garden settlements, although it sits, and the garden settlement principles are very much entwined with sustainability principles that are linked to the sustainability appraisal. There was an exercise carried out that actually looked at the compatibility of the sustainability objectives that were part of the earlier scoping and the garden settlement principles, and in order to inform whether or not the framework that was in place and had any gaps. And I think the conclusion was that there was a need for an additional objective for the sustainability appraisal, specifically for those sites that were of a garden settlement nature. And that was really around the impact on amenity of the neighbouring properties and neighbouring settlements when looking at proposals or options for garden settlement concept, sort of that kind of scale of development, with all of the other objectives fitting and relating very well to the other objectives that were set out in the sustainability appraisal. So these and the coming back to the strategic land availability assessment, again, very much guided by quite sort of rigid guidance, if you like, of the stages that you have to go through, the types of things that have to be assessed. The framework set out for Colchester followed the guidance that's produced related to the National Planning Policy Framework, whereby you have an initial sieve, and then following on from that, the initial sieve is ruling out sites that are too really very small, sites that are very, very remote, and then sort of insurmountable, very difficult insurmountable constraints such as high flood risk areas and highly environmentally significant areas as well. Then moving on, going through all suitability and sustainability criteria, and then looking at environmental constraints, access to services, and issues such as that are more related to the sustainability principles. And then there is also a criteria about availability and achievability, which is all statutory requirements to undertake your strategic land availability assessment. So the framework was put out for consultation, and I think they were done in tandem, and there's obviously a degree of similarity, but they're different processes. And there were a small number of responses, I think 6 in total to 1 and 5 to the strategic land availability assessment, and I think there was an overlap in response to both, in that those that responded to one also responded to the other. The comments coming back, they were varied. They were quite constructive, and actually by and large quite supportive, with some comments on detail about suggesting some additional criteria to be added in. And I think to summarise, many of those points were about detail that I think when we look at the sort of drill down to the detail of what was being said, they're actually covered quite well with the criteria already. There were some other points that were being made that I think we felt have some merit, and think perhaps we do need to go a little bit further in looking at some of the criteria just to be as robust and provide as much clarity and fairness in the assessment process, particularly in looking at things like on the garden settlement sustainability appraisal, criteria around deliverability, and a few points of detail about additional criteria to do with visual impact on a settlement and the surrounding countryside and the distinctive setting of that settlement. I think that there's a little bit more sort of detailed consideration of those points to be made in relation to the objectives that are set out, just to come up with some fine-tuning of what those amendments may be. But and any of those that we would take forward would then be used in the assessment of both the sustainability appraisal and the strategic land availability assessment. So if anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And thank you.
I normally go last, but I'm going to go first this time. So a committee or so ago, we actually had the criteria passed through this committee in a report of what was going to be considered when assessing all of the submissions for consideration. If that's going to be amended or matured, do we need to have that passed back through the committee, is question one. And question two, if we've already started to carry out assessments of that land using an agreed set of criteria that we've in effect signalled or looked at, does that therefore mean that that will affect the outcome or the report, or does it need to be revisited? Because obviously that has a cost implication, because that's more staff time or more external consultant time. They're just the two observations I've got, and if I've misunderstood, I apologise, but that is what jumped off the page.
If I give initial response and then perhaps look to Karen to see if she has anything to add. I think that the nature of any change, and hence really why it's not put forward here in detailed wording, is that it's more about minor tweaks really, rather than and perhaps adding clarity to the criteria that's there, rather than a fundamental change and something entirely new. In the event that sites need to be just double-checked that nothing's been missed, then there's several stages of assessment that needs to be gone through, and I think those checks would be in place as part of the process in any event. I don't know if Karen has anything else to add. No.
No, I don't think I do. I think Sandra's explained they're relatively minor changes. We don't think they'll impact on the work that's been done to date, but it was a good point to raise.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Councillor Ellis, if you'd like to start, please.
I think you've probably asked my question, really, Chairman. That's the point, is we had agreed a set of criteria, and I'm just wondering, with what changes were going to be made. Personally, I actually rather like Mersey Home submission in here, where they've got their, A to F. It seems to make all of those points seem very valid and make perfect sense to me. And I just wonder whether we're taking all of them on board, some of them on board, or what have you. You've already alluded to the first one, I think, visual impact on settlement and all the surrounding countryside. But there are a number of others. They're asking for they're saying calling it a finer grain assessment. Is that something that happens at a later stage, as in do we sort of have is there a broad top-down approach, so you're looking at it in a broad way and then you fine-tune to this sort of level of detail, or is this something that we're looking at now? Because these all make perfect sense to me, and if we're not already doing it, then I think we ought to be, personally.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, and I think I would agree that there's some merit in the points that have been suggested and the way in which that they've been set out. Some of it, I think, is probably actually covered in criteria, and in doing the assessment, we're doing what those points are that are being suggested, but it might not actually be explicitly worded in the criteria. But in making the judgments and carrying out the assessment, we're actually looking at those points. But which is really where I come back to the point where perhaps there's a need to add clarity to what the criteria means rather than actually changing the or bringing in anything entirely new. So I can't say specifically whether we would accept word for word all of what Mersey Homes have suggested, or indeed any of the other representations. But I think our feeling was that yes, they do. In principle, the generality of the points they're making are relevant to the assessment and they do have merit, but it's marrying up with what's already covered anyway. And I think the view is that most of it just maybe need to expand a little on the detail.
I'm just going to jump in front of Councillor Giles. I think this is really important, and this is not something that can have shades of grey. This is an important assessment for the future housing commercial growth of Colchester. I don't feel I'm getting a solid answer. If there are suggestions that are being put forward or tweaks, I didn't get a solid feeling. I don't know about other committee members about whether we are going to react to the feedback or whether we're sort of going to take it on board. I don't think it feels grey. It's either we're going to take some of it on board or we're going to ignore it. I'm not getting a warm feeling, and again, I apologise if we're misunderstanding, but I just want some more clarity on that, and I apologise to Councillor Giles for jumping in, but this is an important point.
Yeah, I fully understand that. Where there are things in here, not just Mersey Homes, but the other responses as well, that require changes, we will make those changes to the assessment criteria. We don't think there's anything in here which fundamentally changes that assessment criteria. For example, if I look at location in relation to delivery of community facilities, I think that's jumping the gun, because until we decide, chicken and egg I suppose, until we decide the growth, then I can't be talking about delivery of community facilities. But the assessment does look to see how close sites are to existing community facilities, and we look at whether there's provision in local community facilities. So I think some of this we're already doing, but what Sandra was meaning is the assessment criteria you saw might not say this exact wording, and what we would do is clarify how we are assessing some of those points. You'll remember that it was 8 or 9 pages of assessment criteria. I can assure you it's the most comprehensive criteria that I've seen a council using. So I think it really is quite robust, but it might need a bit of tinkering. But certainly, if it does need tinkering, we will tinker. And if it's anything more than that, then we'll bring it back to make sure that this committee is happy with it, because you signed it off at the beginning.
Okay, Councillor Jowers, please.
Well, thanks. In a sense, it carries on from what Karen just said, and we've been given some heartening reassurances. But there are some anomalies, really. Cause in the first response says increasing emphasis on regeneration and use of brownfield land, evidence that this has been exhausted. Gladman's say consider the punitive weighting given to brownfield over greenfield sites. That's a big issue on garden settlements. It's interesting, it's changed from garden cities to garden settlements. Yeah. And I'd like more clarity as to what the distinction is between a garden city and a garden settlement. I suspect it's purely numbers. But on that basis, all of them effectively, outside the borough core, are looking at greenfield sites. So do we carry the same punitive weighting? I'm no flag bearer for Gladman's, I can assure you. but nonetheless you have to listen to the points they make. So that's one issue, and then there is another one that you brought up in your presentation, which is flood zone 3B mitigation. Having been sort of to some degree involved in looking at other local plans, I'm looking at very large numbers of homes at Heybridge. And flood mitigation there, I mean, is just unbelievable. But that's the only place they can do it. Therefore, they are permitting flood mitigation. In certain areas of this, we need a very clear view of flexibility. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but you know, inherently, I suspect all the members, the political members of this committee, understand that we are looking at two major areas of development, and potentially in an adjoining district, under duty of cooperation, they are talking about a standalone area. So some of the issues, I agree, I think that generally they're supportive, and Karen's right, we have to cover every avenue, but we always need escape routes in a sense. You know, we need to make sure that when these issues are brought up, they are regarded. And the one about undue weighting on brownfield is really going to stymie us if we do go for some of the areas which we've looked at. How then do we make sure that that sort of coalesces with moving outside the old urban areas? Because, you know, we've been running at 95% brownfield for years, and we've done really, really well. We've run out. You know, the time's coming when actually we have to sort of look at it, from a viability point of view, we have to look at saying we're going to, from a policy point of view, have to build in some flexibility on this. So how are we doing that?
I think if I could just answer on the brownfield greenfield point first of all. I mean, it's relative, and as you say, there's very little brownfield left. So when the assessments are done, I mean, it's a recognised sustainability criteria that you use brownfield before you use greenfield. If you're in the position where there isn't any brownfield, or there's very little brownfield to choose between, then that comparison element is obviously watered down and fails. It's also all of these criteria are all in it's all a balancing act, and they're all taken into account together. So, you know, some will score positively on some elements, and then there's other factors that might override those. Taking things in isolation when you're doing the assessment it's not, it's you look at it in the round, but in terms of the brownfield and greenfield, I think you know it's a comparative process.
Yeah, in a sense, I can understand what you're saying is deliverability. But I was always reassured, you know, going up to, you know, as has been already said, you know, my 30 years of being elected, one wonders. I always thought that the plan was a bit like the Bible. You know, it said, turn the other cheek on one page, and then you went a bit further on, it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And in a way, you know, I'd like something with rather more clarity than that. And I think that we are going to come down to this issue of greenfield versus brownfield in big time. Maybe not as important, the flood risk issue, but then again, I had to look at James and Stones in Brightling-Sea, you know, built up above, they had garaging underneath. There are ways in which you can mitigate, and I think we need to be crystal clear, and that is the grain of it. And as long as we've got that, I'll be satisfied. But what I don't want to do is give too much latitude for personal choice.
Karen, can you just respond to those points, please?
Yeah, there's a few points there. In terms of the brownfield land, obviously there's no longer a target set nationally, which is probably fortunate for us, because we were building at times 95% of new homes on brownfield land. So to a certain extent, it all came at once, and it's hard to maintain that within the borough. So I think we're under no illusions that you know, we can deliver that sort of development on brownfield land going forward. We'll certainly have to comply with the MPPF that says that we should should encourage the effective use of land by using previously developed land, brownfield land, provided that it is not of high environmental value. So that's another consideration. And if you'll recall, in the draft MPPF, there was actually no reference to favouring the use of brownfield land. So that was something which the government did take notice of the uproar about and introduce. And then they said local authorities can consider setting their own targets for brownfield land. So localism at its best. The point about garden settlements and garden cities changing, there's been no change. You can find the word garden in front of just about anything, including a few hundred dwellings in a village these days. Sounds better, doesn't it? What I would say, the only definition I'm aware of is in the Town and Country Planning Association document, Garden Cities for the Future, a prospectus, which suggests 15,000 as a target for a garden city. I don't know that there's a definition for a garden settlement, a garden extension, a garden village. Like I say, there's all sorts of things that are used. Flood mitigation, I think we are flexible, and sometimes we have to fight quite hard with the Environment Agency. But you'll probably recall last plan around, we had special dispensation for the Hive area, because the weighting to regenerating that area was given, tipped the balance in terms of the flood risk there. And mitigation measures have been implemented to allow development that is still safe, although it's in that flood zone. So I think we're aware of some of those considerations, but it's useful to bring them to the fore.
Yeah, that's a very good answer, Chairman. And the only concluding thing is that one could argue that if we have an excess of employment land, which would have become brownfield land, then why should we not be looking at actually allocated employment sites rather than totally greenfield sites for whatever garden grabbing, garden growing, garden whatever you may call it. So, you know, maybe we need to extend this argument slightly further. I'm just thinking of a planning session I went to.
Just a general comment, and I'll respond generally as well, and say that obviously land is only classed as brownfield or previously developed once it has been developed, of course, not prior to planning permission being granted or indeed implemented. It remains greenfield until that stage. But rest assured, the employment land studies that we will do will look at employment land and the likelihood of it coming forward. And last time around we allocated, maybe in hindsight it wasn't such a good idea, but we allocated some employment land in Tiptree for housing. And that was on the basis that there was sufficient land allocated there, and it wasn't considered by the independent specialists who undertook the work that all of the land was actually required in that area, because people, by the sounds of it, are going to Malden and Braintree.
Next on my list is Councillor Oxford, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm reading the Mersey Homes A to F on page 79, and you could use some of their comments to fit just about anything. If you're going to have a garden city, it's going to be close to somebody at some stage. You know, it could be built on agricultural land, indeed. But so I think some of their A to Fs are a little bit red herrings in that regard. I think if you have to bite the bullet and build something like a garden city, 15,000 houses, it's going to be a large area that it covers. So you can't miss it.
Sandra, do you want to just respond to that?
Yes, I think in terms of the scale of, I think that's one of the reasons for looking at making sure that the assessment criteria covers all of the principles that are relative to a garden settlement development, and weaving them so that you can see where they relate to the objectives of the sustainability appraisal, because they are different to the smaller sites, which the sustainability appraisal objectives will also be used for. So I think the whole sort of concept, it is, you have to look at it in the context of the scale that is being proposed and make the judgment accordingly. And it's also to be used, the whole nature of these assessments are to be used in a comparative way, so that you're comparing different sites and options so that you can see the relative impact in the criteria that's used. So you're not, obviously the scale is looking at it for a garden settlement, the scale of obviously 15,000. I think the figure that's set out that we're saying in the framework that this assessment would be applied to would be anything over 4,000, which is not equally a significant scale, but it is a significant scale and is also likely to have significant impact. So I think that is accepted and understood, but the criteria is attempting to reflect the principles that go with that scale of development.
Yeah, if you want to come back, please.
We had training sessions, that's what I'm calling them, the local plan ones, at the first site. The second one, we had a gentleman come over, I've forgotten his name already, but he was talking, sorry? Sir Brian Briscoe, right. And he was talking about garden cities, and he had very strong knowledge on the likes of Welling and Hatfield and so on. And he said, in order to be viable, you need at least 15,000. So there's your figure. And to be honest, land-wise, we can't go south because of garrison land, and then a few villages, and we wouldn't be putting significant numbers there. East, we're up to the boundary with tendering. North, we're up to the boundary with everywhere. So we're only left pretty much with west. So that's where we're at.
Nothing further to add to that point. So for some brevity and succinctness, Councillor Arnold.
I'll do my best, Chairman. The last bullet point on page 80 and the second bullet point on page 81. I'm still a bit nervous, as you were at the start, Chairman, about whether or not these things actually require a stamp of approval from the committee. When it's a comment like the second bullet point on 81, I can see that there would actually be the opportunity within the public consultation process we've got coming up in the late winter to deal with something like that, because somebody is going to be able to come in and say, well, you've ruled out the site that I put in on the basis of your published criteria, but we can mitigate it thus. And I think there are lots of things in here that come under that category. But as far as neighbourhood plans are concerned, firstly, I think Karen could have complete confidence that the committee would agree with her that neighbourhood plans stay, but that is not going to be good enough to satisfy a landowner or a developer, because the developer is actually going to want that decision brought to the committee, I suspect. And then, listening to the debate that there has been in the last few minutes about this, I still feel that I would be a lot more comfortable if this stuff came back to committee, formally commented upon, so that we could agree changes if there were to be any changes. Otherwise, I think we're leaving ourselves open to debate at a later stage, which is going to take up an enormous amount of time and work. I think the quicker, cheaper, shorter option is actually to bring it back to the committee in advance.
in a sort of table format like we've used before?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point, and I support that. My only question is, the next meeting is on the 14th of December. Is that too late? Do we need an interim note, or are you happy that that fits the timescales? Okay, that's fine. Fine. Thank you. Councillor Arnold, anything else? Thank you. So next we have Councillor Blundell, and then that is my list
Brief.
done.
I think my question's nearly been answered. I was trying to find out, I think a lot of Colchester public are very concerned about the local plan generally and, you know, how many houses are going to be imposed on them. And I think they're particularly nervous when they hear the words a garden settlement or something, you know, something like that. I was going to ask what is the normally largest number you would expect, and I think I'm being told 15,000, and I think no? Go on then, all right, tell me the worst.
Yeah, 15,000 is the figure given for a true garden city to be viable and to meet the, I think it's 9 or 12 principles in a garden city. I don't believe there's a maximum.
You don't?
There isn't. But we're not going to have 15,000 developed in Colchester either, so we should just stop using. Sorry, Chairman. As I understand it, we are not going to have a single site in Colchester that's going to have 15,000 houses built on it. Therefore, we should all stop referring to garden cities because we ain't going to have one. Hence.
Listen, I was speaking.
Sorry.
Never say never. Sorry.
Well, not.
All I'm saying is I think we need some more clarification about this. I think it would calm nerves or, you know, help interest if people knew a little bit more about what garden cities might entail and what sort of areas might be chosen for them. And if we did have garden cities, but what benefits they might bring. I think people are just nervous, don't know enough about it, and I would like to hear some more information made generally available, please.
I would just like to add some clarity, because I agree that 15,000 houses does seem to be the number that is linked to the term garden city, and I did actually have a couple of conversations with Ian Vipond about this following the workshop that we had with Sir Brian Brusco, because I had similar concerns. And Ian has pointed me at some reading, which I'm happy to share with the committee, where you can almost use lesser numbers, and it still seems to have the term garden associated with it, but you kind of enclose that part of Colchester with smaller housing numbers, is kind of how it was described, or how I understood it. But 15,000, I agree with Councillor Arnold. There are a few places you could potentially do that, although I'm not going to surmise and influence any outcomes of what sites may or may not be inside, because we don't know till they're properly assessed. But I do agree this fixation with 15,000, I think we do need to get under the covers of that a bit more, so maybe a future report or some further clarity at the next committee in December might not be a bad idea. I'll defer to Karen for comment.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think maybe in the interim I could just send a link to the prospectus that the TCPA published, and also I think there's a 2-page paper just on the principles, which I think just summarises what a true garden city should encompass. Actually, I've just said that, and I think the TCPA published something last month as well about how you can use lessons sort of from the past new towns and garden cities and use it in the future. So I'll put some links in an email maybe and send them around, and then you can let me know if you still want a report at the next meeting, or...
We also have the principles and the issues and options.
And then, you know, it may be that Sir Brian Briscoe can come here and present to committee.
I'm happy with that approach. I think let's get Karen to get that email out again, if we can make sure that's clear as an action in the minutes, please, Mandy, in your excellent summary when you've typed it up. And then if necessary we can bring something back to a future committee, I think, possibly in December. Okay, fine. I think that has debated this section well. It's an important report, actually, very important. So we are asked to note the responses, although we have asked for some further clarification. So are you happy? Thank you. So that is the end of this meeting. Thank you to members of the public for coming. One other thing I would like us to just get a quick update on at a future committee is our budget position, because you asked about that, Councillor Blundell, in my first ever meeting. I'd just like to get a quick update on that in a future meeting, if I may, because we haven't looked at that. It'll only be a one-pager, but I think we should have a look at that. If you remember, the approach I agreed is the budget figure that Karen's got will only track external spend. We're not going to try and offset staff time or any other things that accountants like to do. So I'll ask for that in another meeting. So thank you, everyone. Next meeting is December the 14th. Look 14th, and look forward to seeing you all there. Have a good evening. Thank you.